The M3 grease gun submachine gun was so crude that American soldiers initially refused to trust it, so cheap that General Motors built it in an automotive factory, and so lethal at close range that German soldiers in the hedgerows of Normandy came to fear its slow, deliberate bark more than almost any other weapon on the Western Front. Most histories of American firepower in World War II start with the M1 Garand, General George Patton's famous greatest battle implement ever devised. Most of those histories go on to cover the Thompson submachine gun, the Chicago typewriter, the weapon of gangsters and G-men that Hollywood had already made iconic before the first American soldier set foot on a European beach. The M3 grease gun is a different story entirely. The M3 grease gun is what happens when the most powerful industrial nation on Earth decides that winning a war matters more than looking good doing it. It was designed not in a famous armory with a century of tradition behind it, but in approximately 6 months, by an engineer from General Motors, a firearms designer, and a U.S. Army Ordnance officer working under wartime deadline pressure with the explicit goal of building something that cost less than $20 and could be assembled by workers who had never touched a firearm in their lives. And it worked. Not just worked. The M3 grease gun worked well enough that the United States Army kept it in active service inventory for nearly 50 years after World War II ended. American tank crews were still carrying M3 grease guns into combat during the Gulf War in 1991. Adopted in December 1942, still being fired in anger in the Iraqi desert nearly half a century later. That is what the M3 grease gun accomplished. And to understand why German soldiers feared it, you first have to understand the crisis that created it. By mid-1942, the United States had been at war for roughly 6 months, and the American military-industrial complex was staring down a problem that popular histories of the Second World War almost never addressed directly. The problem was not courage. American soldiers had that in abundance. Not will, not raw materials, not industrial capacity. The problem was the Thompson submachine gun, and more specifically, what the Thompson submachine gun cost: $45 per unit. That was the price tag on a Thompson M1A1 in wartime 1942 production, and in that era, $45 represented nearly a week's wages for an average American factory worker. The United States military needed submachine guns not in the thousands, but in the hundreds of thousands and potentially millions. Nobody disputes that the Thompson was a magnificent weapon. It was sturdy, accurate for its class, powerful, and it had spent 15 years building a fearsome reputation in the hands of criminals and lawmen alike. But the Thompson had been designed when precision machining was the standard, when each component was carefully shaped from solid steel, when craftsmanship was measured in hours spent per part. Approximately 50 machined parts went into each Thompson, every one of them requiring skilled labor, specialized machinery, and time that a nation fighting a global war could not afford to waste. And skilled machinists in a country simultaneously building aircraft carriers, Sherman tanks, B-17 bombers, and tens of millions of weapons were the scarcest resource of all. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department ran the numbers in mid-1942 and arrived at a strategically obvious but practically daunting conclusion. What was needed was a submachine gun that cost a fraction of the Thompson, could be built by workers with no firearms experience whatsoever, and could reach not just frontline infantry, but armored crews, paratroopers, military engineers, OSS operatives, and resistance fighters across occupied Europe. The weapon that answered that requirement, commissioned, designed, prototyped, tested, and approved in approximately 6 months, was the M3 grease gun. To understand what the M3 grease gun represented as an engineering achievement, you need to meet the 3 men who built it, because none of them came from where you might expect. George Hyde was a firearms designer, not a famous one, not a John Browning or a Hiram Maxim, but a competent and practical engineer who understood the mechanics of automatic weapons and, more usefully, understood the difference between what a weapon needed to do and what it looked like it was doing. Earlier designs that never reached mass production had sharpened Hyde's instincts for what soldiers actually needed in combat, which turned out to be very different from what they asked for in peacetime evaluations. Frederick Sampson was the chief engineer at General Motors' Inland Division, and Sampson was not primarily a firearms man. He was an automotive engineer, someone who spent his professional life working out how to manufacture complex mechanical objects quickly, cheaply, and reliably at industrial scale. In 1942, that background turned out to be exactly the qualification the M3 grease gun needed. Rene Studler was the U.S. Army Ordnance officer whose research and development board oversaw the project's institutional requirements. Studler understood military procurement constraints and battlefield demands in ways that shaped the weapon's practical specifications. His involvement ensured the design met Army standards while maintaining the radical cost and manufacturing targets. Together, Hyde, Sampson, and Studler approached the problem the way you'd expect an automotive engineer to approach a new car model, not by asking how to build the finest possible weapon, but by asking what the weapon absolutely needed to do, and what was the cheapest, fastest, most reliable path to making it do those things. The answer they landed on was sheet metal stampings, a manufacturing approach pioneered by the British Sten gun, though applied here with American industrial capacity. Instead of machining components from solid steel billets, a process demanding skilled labor and specialized equipment, Hyde, Sampson, and Studler designed the M3 grease gun so that the majority of its parts could be stamped from flat sheet metal, bent into shape, welded, and assembled with minimal precision work. The same basic process used to manufacture automobile body panels, the same process used to make tin cans. And that decision led to one of the more quietly extraordinary facts about American weapons production in World War II. The primary manufacturer of the M3 grease gun during the war was a factory in Anderson, Indiana, General Motors' Guide Lamp Division, that had spent the previous decade making automotive lighting components, car headlights. That plant built over 600,000 submachine guns, and it did so without any prior firearms manufacturing experience, because Hyde, Sampson, and Studler had designed a weapon that didn't require any. Official adoption came in December 1942, production opened in earnest in early 1943, and by that year, American soldiers in both the European and Pacific theaters were beginning to receive the weapon that would replace the Thompson as the standard American submachine gun. The specifications tell part of the story. The M3 grease gun chambered the same cartridge as the Thompson, the .45 ACP, the .45 automatic Colt pistol round, developed by John Browning in 1904, and fed from a 30-round magazine. Unloaded, it weighed approximately 7¼ pounds, which climbed to just under 10 pounds with a full magazine seated. At 29.8 inches with the stock extended, it could be collapsed to 22.8 inches, compact enough to stow inside a tank or an armored half-track. But the specification that shaped every engagement in which the M3 grease gun appeared was the rate of fire, approximately 450 rounds per minute. That number sounds unremarkable until you compare it to the weapon it was replacing. The Thompson M1A1 cycled at approximately 700 to 800 rounds per minute. The German MP40, the Wehrmacht standard submachine gun, ran at approximately 550. The M3 grease gun was the slowest firing submachine gun fielded by any major combatant in World War II, and that was entirely, deliberately, by design. When American soldiers first received the M3 and discovered its slow cyclic rate, most of them read it as a flaw, a symptom of cheap construction, evidence that the Army had handed them a cut-rate weapon while the real money went somewhere else. The M3 grease gun's appearance did nothing to improve those first impressions. Its tubular receiver, its wire stock, its general resemblance to the tool a mechanic uses to pump grease into a chassis all pointed to something improvised rather than manufactured. But Hyde, Sampson, and Studler had not accidentally built a slow weapon. They had engineered a slow weapon on purpose, and the reasoning behind that decision reflects a sophisticated understanding of how submachine guns actually get used in combat, as opposed to how they appear in training manuals. A submachine gun is not a precision rifle. It exists to deliver high-volume, large-caliber fire at close range, inside buildings, in trenches, across the few meters separating two soldiers in a hedgerow or a shattered village. At those distances, accuracy matters less than control, and control is precisely what a high cyclic rate destroys. When the Thompson fired at 700 to 800 rounds per minute, a soldier pulling through a full burst could empty a 30-round magazine in approximately 2.5 seconds. In those 2.5 seconds, muzzle rise, the tendency of an automatic weapon to climb as it fires, dragged the barrel off target after the first few rounds, which meant most of the burst went somewhere other than the intended target. Ammunition spent, enemy not down, magazine empty, soldier now fumbling with a reload in the middle of a firefight. At 450 rounds per minute, the same 30-round magazine lasted the soldier approximately 4 to 5 seconds, and 4 to 5 seconds of controlled fire gave even a minimally trained shooter the time to walk rounds onto target and make each bullet count. And here is the detail that almost never gets mentioned in accounts of the M3 grease gun. At 450 rounds per minute, a soldier with practiced trigger discipline could fire single rounds from a weapon that had no semi-automatic mode and no fire selector switch at all. The M3 was full automatic only, no setting for single shots, no selector lever, nothing. But the slow cyclic rate meant that a brief trigger pull released 1 round, or 2, or 3, precise and controlled, from a fully automatic weapon, achieved purely through trigger technique. That is not a design compromise, that is the whole point. The slow cyclic rate was not the only piece of mechanical thinking embedded in the M3 grease gun's deliberately stripped-down design. Consider the safety mechanism. Most firearms of the era used a dedicated manual safety lever, a button or catch that physically blocked the firing mechanism. The M3 grease gun used the dust cover over the ejection port instead. Open the cover and the weapon was ready to fire. Close it and a physical block stopped the bolt from moving. One action, opening the cover to clear the ejection port of debris, simultaneously prepared the weapon for use. In the conditions American soldiers faced in Normandy's hedgerows, in the rubble of German cities, in the mud of the Hürtgen forest, a weapon that could be readied with one hand in one motion without taking your eyes off the threat was a weapon that could save your life in the half-second between spotting danger and responding to it. Then came the M3A1 in 1944, and the engineers managed to simplify an already simple weapon even further. The M3A1 eliminated the manual cocking handle entirely. A hole cut into the bolt face replaced it, meaning the soldier inserted a finger and pulled the bolt to the rear. One fewer moving part, one fewer component that could break or seize with mud or freeze in cold weather. One fewer thing to go wrong when everything else already had. The entire M3A1 could be field stripped with no tools whatsoever, disassembled and reassembled under conditions that would have made servicing a Thompson extremely difficult. Loose mechanical tolerances handled the rest. Grit, sand, mud, and water that would have stopped a more precisely fitted weapon simply passed through the M3's action without interrupting it, and the same manufacturing approach that made the weapon cheaper to build ended up making it more reliable in the field. That trade-off was not accidental. It was engineered to Understand why German soldiers came to fear the M3 grease gun specifically, rather than American firepower in general, you need to understand the cartridge it fired. John Browning developed the .45 ACP in 1904, following the Philippine-American War, where American soldiers had discovered that smaller caliber pistol cartridges failed to stop determined opponents at close range. What the Army wanted was a round that would deliver immediate incapacitation, and Browning's answer was a bullet of exceptional mass, moving at deliberately subsonic speed. The standard .45 ACP ball cartridge fires a 230-grain bullet, roughly 15 grams of lead and copper jacket, at approximately 830 to 920 feet per second. The 9mm parabellum round, fired by the German MP40, typically pushed a 115 to 124 grain bullet at velocities between 1,100 and 1,400 feet per second. The physics here matter. The 9mm round carries its energy and velocity, lighter and faster. The .45 ACP carries its energy in mass, torque, heavier and slower. At typical submachine gun engagement ranges under 50 meters, both rounds are lethal, but the wound characteristics differ in ways that mattered enormously to the soldiers on the receiving end. The heavy, slow .45 ACP projectile transferred a greater share of its energy to tissue on impact, creating a larger permanent wound channel without depending on fragmentation or yaw, effects that smaller, faster rounds sometimes rely on, and that can behave inconsistently at varying ranges and through different materials. For a German soldier in the confined spaces of a Norman village, a French basement, a Belgian farmhouse, or a trench in the Siegfried Line, being engaged at 10 or 15 or 20 meters by .45A CP fire from an M3 grease gun meant facing a round with a high probability of immediate incapacitation on each hit. And the terrain of the Western Front's most contested campaigns in 1944 and 1945 put German soldiers inside that lethal radius again and again and again. When American forces landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, and pushed inland from the beaches, they encountered a landscape that dismantled every advantage their planners had assumed they possessed. The Bocage. The Norman Bocage is a system of fields enclosed by ancient earthen banks, hedgerows in the most literal sense, that had been growing and compacting for centuries before any tank existed. These earthen walls, often 4 to 6 feet high and as much as 3 feet thick, topped with dense root systems and heavy vegetation, did not slow armor. The Bocage stopped armor outright. An M4 Sherman attempting to push through a Bocage wall reared up, exposed its thin belly plating, and became a stationary target. The result was a nightmarish series of small unit actions, field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, lane by lane. Effective engagement range in Bocage fighting frequently fell under 20 meters, often under 10, and soldiers heard the enemy before they saw them. First visual contact sometimes came at arm's length. In that environment, the German Army's foundational tactical doctrine, built around the Karabiner 98K bolt-action rifle as the standard infantryman's weapon, performed catastrophically. The Kar 98K was an excellent rifle at 200 meters, 300 meters, 500 meters, in open terrain with clear fields of fire. At 15 meters in a Norman hedgerow lane, the bolt-action cycle time that was irrelevant at range became a death sentence. Each shot required manually cycling the bolt, lift, pull back, push forward, push down, approximately 1 second for a trained soldier under ideal conditions, and far longer under fire, in cramped terrain with an M3 grease gun running at the shooter from a few meters away. The German Army had partially addressed this vulnerability with the MP40, issued primarily to NCOs, officers, and vehicle crews. The MP40 was a capable weapon, reliable and reasonably controllable, and its 9mm cartridge was adequate for close-range work. But the MP40 went to specialist roles, not to standard riflemen. German doctrine assumed that automatic fire in close combat would come from light machine gun teams rather than from individual soldiers carrying personal automatic weapons. The M3 grease gun had disrupted that assumption entirely. At $15 to $20 per unit, one-third to one-half the cost of a Thompson, the M3 could go to everyone: armored vehicle crews, combat engineers, paratroopers, ranger battalions, OSS operatives, Signal Corps troops working near the front, supply soldiers who might find themselves in unexpected contact with the enemy. By the time American forces were pushing through France in the late summer of 1944, German soldiers were encountering M3 grease guns across the entire American order of battle. Not a specialized weapon for specialized troops, a ubiquitous one. And in the Bocage, in the shattered villages of Normandy, in the brutal close-range fighting of the Falaise Pocket, that ubiquity translated directly into German casualties. Normandy demonstrated the M3 grease gun's effectiveness in agricultural close terrain. The Hürtgen forest demonstrated it in the most brutal possible conditions, and also clarified without ambiguity what the M3 was not. Fought by American forces from September 1944 through February 1945, the Hürtgen Forest Campaign ranked among the most costly engagements for American infantry in the entire European war. Dense forest, prepared German defensive positions, minefields, artillery pre-registered on every trail and clearing, winter conditions that turned mud to ice and froze weapons, ammunition, and soldiers alike. The M3 grease gun's loose tolerances and simple mechanism proved their worth in the cold, where weapons with tighter-fitting components suffered disproportionate failure rates as lubricating oils thickened and parts contracted unevenly. The M3's mechanical clearances provided a margin of tolerance that kept the weapon cycling when others had stopped. But the Hürtgen also illustrated the M3 grease gun's limits with equal clarity. Effective range topped out at approximately 50 to 100 meters, and in open terrain, or in the long forest clearings and fire breaks where German defenders had established interlocking fields of fire, the M3 was outranged by essentially every other weapon on the battlefield. The same heavy .45 ACP bullet that performed so well at close range lost velocity and accuracy rapidly past 100 meters. And a German soldier in a prepared bunker 200 meters away was effectively outside the M3's practical envelope. American commanders who understood this used the M3 in combination with M1 Garands, BARs, and machine guns, a combined arms approach at the squad and platoon level that covered the M3's range limitations while exploiting its close-range lethality. The weapon was not a substitute for a rifle. It was a complement to one, and commanders who used it as anything else paid for the mistake. What the German Army's institutional response to American SMG dominance in close terrain revealed was equally telling. The Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first true assault rifle, combining the range of a rifle cartridge with the automatic fire capability of a submachine gun, acknowledged implicitly what German soldiers had learned in the hedgerows and forest fighting. A nation that could put fully automatic weapons into the hands of every soldier, not just NCOs and officers, held a fundamental close combat advantage. The STG-44 arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to change the strategic equation, but its development was itself a kind of tribute to what the M3 grease gun and weapons like it had accomplished on the Western Front. The story of the M3 grease gun in American hands is not a simple arc of immediate acceptance and universal approval, and it is more honest for that. When American soldiers first received the M3 in 1943, the reaction was, to put it diplomatically, mixed. The Thompson had a reputation, and the Thompson looked the part. It had heft, substance, the kind of mechanical solidity that a soldier trusting a weapon with his life reasonably expects to feel in his hands. Hollywood had spent 15 years making the Thompson synonymous with raw, decisive firepower, and a soldier handed a Thompson felt equipped, armed, ready. A soldier handed an M3 grease gun felt, by the accounts of veterans who experienced that moment, vaguely cheated. Period press accounts described it as looking like the result of a plumber's nightmare, and the description was not unfair. The wire stock, a simple folding metal frame that served as both a shoulder rest and a cleaning rod holder, did nothing to suggest precision engineering. The entire weapon had the aesthetic of something improvised, and in the hands it felt lighter, cheaper, and less substantial than the Thompson it was replacing. Many soldiers actively tried to hold on to their Thompsons when the M3 arrived as a replacement, and unit commanders in some theaters reported resistance to the transition that persisted well into 1944. Not because the Thompson outperformed the M3 in actual combat, but because it felt superior to men who had not yet tested both weapons under fire. That changed in the hedgerows. Combat clarifies preferences very quickly, and the soldiers who questioned the M3's stamped metal construction changed their assessment after watching it cycle reliably through mud and rain that had stopped other weapons. Those who doubted its utility reconsidered after experiencing the controlled burst capability that the slow cyclic rate actually delivered, and those who missed the Thompson's familiar weight made their peace with the M3 grease gun when they understood without any remaining abstraction what a .45 ACP round did at 15 meters. The derisive nickname grease gun became over time something closer to dark affection. The weapon that looked like a mechanic's tool had survived the only test that matters. It had kept soldiers alive in situations where a more expensive and more finely crafted weapon might have failed, and in the economy of combat, where the only metric that counts is whether the weapon functions when you need it, the M3 grease gun had earned its standing. One of the least discussed dimensions of the M3 grease gun's wartime service unfolds not on the conventional battlefields of France and Germany, but in the shadow war running simultaneously through the Office of Strategic Services, the American Intelligence and Special Operations Organization that was the direct predecessor of the Central Intelligence Agency. The OSS ran agents throughout occupied Europe, coordinated with resistance networks, organized sabotage operations, and conducted direct action missions behind German lines, and the operatives doing that work needed weapons that were compact, reliable, easy to conceal, and effective in the close-range ambushes and raids that defined partisan warfare. With its wire stock collapsed to 22.8 inches, shorter than many pistol-caliber carbines, the M3 grease gun fit that requirement well. OSS personnel issued M3s widely to resistance fighters and their own field operatives across occupied France, the Low Countries, and beyond. For resistance fighters with limited training and limited opportunity to practice, the M3's forgiving operating characteristics were a practical advantage. The slow cyclic rate reduced the consequences of trigger control errors, the manual of arms was simple enough to learn quickly, and the maintenance requirements were minimal enough to manage without dedicated support. The presence of M3 grease guns in occupied territories also carried a weight beyond their tactical utility. An M3 in the hands of a French partisan or a Belgian Maquis fighter was visible evidence of American material commitment to liberation, tangible proof that the resources of American industry were flowing through underground channels to the people fighting from within. German security forces in occupied territories became aware of the M3's presence among resistance fighters, which added another dimension to the weapon's psychological reach. It was not merely a threat on the conventional battlefield. The M3 grease gun could appear anywhere, in a city, in a safe house, in the hands of someone who looked nothing like a soldier, and delivered devastating close-range fire before disappearing back into the civilian landscape. A note of care is warranted here because overstating the case helps no one. Fear is a tactical reality in warfare, but it is rarely as simple or as universal as popular accounts suggest. German soldiers in World War II were, by any objective assessment, among the most professionally trained and tactically capable soldiers of the conflict. The Wehrmacht's institutional culture pushed individual initiative, small unit cohesion, and the ability to adapt to unexpected situations in ways many armies of the era could not match. These were not men who frightened easily. But German soldiers were also rational professionals who assessed threats accurately, and the threat posed by the M3 grease gun in specific tactical contexts was real, quantifiable, and qualitatively different from the threat of American rifle fire. Consider what German infantry doctrine assumed about submachine guns entering 1944. The MP-40 went to NCOs, officers, and vehicle crews. Standard riflemen carried the KAR-98K. Automatic fire in close combat came from light machine gun teams, the MG-42 and its predecessors, not from individual soldiers carrying personal automatic weapons. That organizational structure assumed the enemy's automatic fire capability was similarly distributed, concentrated in specialist weapons teams rather than spread across every man in a patrol. The M3 grease gun had broken that assumption at the root. When every American soldier in a patrol, riflemen, engineers, headquarters personnel, vehicle crews, might be carrying a fully automatic weapon chambered in .45 ACP, German tactical calculations about fire superiority in close terrain stopped being reliable. German forces in Normandy had entered the Bocage expecting to use the hedgerow terrain to channel and slow American advances, forcing the Americans into prepared kill zones where German marksmanship and the MG-42's rate of fire would extract decisive casualties. That strategy worked in open lanes and approaches up to a point. But in the lateral hedgerow lanes, in the farm courtyards and village streets, where Bocage fighting devolved into something closer to brawling than conventional infantry combat, German riflemen facing American soldiers with M3 grease guns were at a fundamental disadvantage. The bolt-action cycle time that was irrelevant at 300 meters became fatal at 15, and the volume of automatic .45 ACP fire that an American squad could generate, with multiple M3 grease guns cycling simultaneously, exceeded what a standard German infantry squad armed with KAR-98K rifles and a single MP-40 could return. That tactical reality accumulated slowly, repeated across hundreds of small unit engagements through the summer and fall of 1944, building into institutional knowledge. German soldiers learned from experience and from the accounts of survivors what it meant to be on the receiving end of M3 fire in confined terrain, not through a single dramatic incident, but through the grinding accumulation of encounters in which the M3 grease guns combination of heavy caliber, controllable cyclic rate, and wide distribution repeatedly delivered results. The STG-44's development, Germany's urgent push to field a weapon that could match American close combat capability, was in part a direct institutional response to exactly that problem. The German army that had gone to war with its doctrine built around the accurate rifleman was being forced to reconsider its fundamental assumptions about how individual soldiers should be armed, and that reconsideration was driven significantly by what American soldiers carrying inexpensive stamped metal submachine guns were doing in the fields of France. Production of the M3 grease gun wound down when World War II ended in 1945, having reached approximately 622,000 units, and the American military contracted from its wartime size. What the M3 grease gun did not do was disappear. American forces carried the M3 into Korea, where its performance in cold weather conditions, the same loose tolerances and simple mechanism that had served it in the Hürtgen forest winter, proved its value again on the Korean peninsula. The M3A1 variant, with its finger-hole bolt cocking system and further reduced parts count, stayed in active service through the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s. Vietnam saw the M3A1 in limited American service, but found wider use in the hands of South Vietnamese forces, for whom the compact dimensions and simple operation made it well suited to jungle warfare. But the most arresting chapter of the M3 grease gun's operational life came in the desert, during a conflict that few people associate with a World War II submachine gun. Operation Desert Storm, 1991. Nearly 50 years after the M3's adoption. American armored vehicle crews were still carrying M3A1 grease guns as personal weapons, and the reasoning was the same as it had always been. The M3A1's collapsed length of under 23 inches made it the most practical personal weapon for the cramped interior of an M1 Abrams tank or a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. An M16 rifle was awkward to stow and deploy in that confined space. The M3A1, unchanged in any meaningful way from what the Guide Lamp Division had built in Anderson, Indiana in 1943, still solved that problem better than most alternatives nearly half a century later. A service life of approximately 48 to 50 years, from adoption to final combat deployment. From a weapon designed to be cheap, disposable, and good enough, a weapon that soldiers initially dismissed as a plumber's nightmare, that longevity is nothing short of extraordinary. And it was only possible because the design was right from the beginning. Not flashy, not impressive to look at, not the weapon any soldier would have chosen if handed a catalog and told to pick his favorite. But right, functionally and tactically right, for the role it was asked to fill across 5 decades and multiple conflicts. The M3 grease gun's legacy in military small arms development extends well past its own service life. The principle it embodied, that a weapon built from stamped sheet metal by workers with no firearms experience could outperform a precision-machined weapon built by specialists once actual combat conditions were applied, was not widely accepted in 1942. It was treated as a wartime compromise, a temporary measure to be abandoned when peace returned and normal manufacturing standards could be restored. Peace did not restore those standards. The M3 had proved the principle, and the post-war decades saw stamped and pressed metal construction spread across military small arms development worldwide. The Soviet AK-47, the most widely produced firearm in human history, used receiver construction principles drawing from the same manufacturing logic that Hyde, Sampson, and Studler had applied to the M3 grease gun. Build for function. Build for reliability. Build for the conditions soldiers actually fight in, not the conditions the procurement office imagined. Except that a weapon looking crude but cycling reliably is worth more than a weapon looking impressive but failing in the mud. Argentina licensed the M3 design and built its own version, the PAM, or Pistola Ametralladora, that remained in service for decades after the war. Canada produced variants. The basic design philosophy shaped weapons programs across multiple nations, drawing lessons from American experience in World War II. At the doctrinal level, the M3 grease gun reinforced an argument about individual soldier armament that the U.S. military would grapple with through Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The argument that individual soldiers benefit from fully automatic fire capability, that automatic weapons should not be confined to specialist roles, and that the weight and cost of individual weapons should be calibrated to maximize the number of soldiers equipped rather than to maximize the capabilities of a smaller, more specialized subset. That argument, which the M3 grease gun helped settle in practical terms during World War II, led directly to the development and adoption of the M16 rifle, a fully automatic weapon issued to every American soldier, regardless of specialty. The logic that made the M3 effective in the Bocage was the same logic that drove American infantry doctrine toward universal automatic capability in the decades that followed. The dark truth about why German soldiers feared the M3 grease gun is not a story about superior technology, not a story about exceptional marksmanship or elite training or the tactical genius of individual commanders. The dark truth is simpler than any of those stories, and in some ways more unsettling. German soldiers feared the M3 grease gun because the United States of America could manufacture 622,000 of them at $15 to $20 each, in a factory that had previously made car headlights, in a nation that had been at war for less than 2 years. German soldiers feared the M3 grease gun because it meant that every American soldier, not every third soldier, not every officer and NCO, but every soldier regardless of role or specialty, could be equipped with a fully automatic weapon firing a cartridge that delivered devastating close-range stopping power. Because in the Bocage of Normandy and the ruins of German cities and the frozen forests of Belgium, the advantage conferred by that distribution was not theoretical. It was measurable in German casualties and American objectives taken. German soldiers feared the M3 grease gun because it was the physical embodiment of an industrial philosophy that the Wehrmacht, for all its tactical brilliance, for all the courage and professionalism of its soldiers, had no answer to. A weapon that costs $15 to build cannot be defeated by a doctrine. You cannot outmaneuver an enemy's manufacturing capacity with a better tactical plan. The M3 grease gun was ugly. It was cheap. It looked like something assembled by a plumber on a lunch break. American soldiers who first received it preferred the Thompson, the weapon that looked the part, the weapon that felt like it, meant business. But looks are not stopping power. Aesthetics are not reliability. The preferences of soldiers who had not yet been shot at carry less weight than the judgment of soldiers who have. In the end, the M3 grease gun was exactly what the Second World War required. Not the finest weapon conceivable, but the right weapon, built in the right quantities, at the right cost, available to the right soldiers, at the right moment in history. The German soldiers who encountered it in the hedgerows and the forests and the shattered cities of northwestern Europe understood that, even though the industrial logic behind it was invisible to them, they understood it the way soldiers always understand tactical reality, not through analysis, but through experience. They understood it in the pause between the slow, deliberate reports of a .45A CP submachine gun cycling at 450 rounds per minute, and the silence that followed.